You are listening to the What a Word podcast, an interview style podcast where guests bring their unique experiences and insight on culture, life's challenges, and faith. Each episode is seasoned with words which will inspire and encourage. Now, here is your host, Ryan Sharp.
Welcome to the What a Word podcast. My guest today is Andre Johnson. Andre has roots in Jamaica. He grew up in Decoy, St. Mary, and from there went on to pursue his studies. He's currently practicing as an attorney in Knox County in the Public Defender's Community Law Office there. His early educational history, double major in history and linguistics at the University of the West Indies in Mona, Jamaica. Continued with a bachelor's of law at the University of the West Indies in Cave Hill, Barbados, and subsequently pursued a master's of law program at Maurice A. Dean School of Law at Hofstra University in Long Island, New York. He now serves the indigent and marginalized. I told him before we started recording how excited I am to speak with someone who is doing work that gives voice to the voiceless. Please join me in welcoming Andre Johnson to the What a Word podcast. Welcome, Andre.
Thank you, Ryan. Thank you so much for having me here. I look forward to sharing with your viewers, and I hope that after they've listened, that somebody will feel motivated and inspired by my story. That's my only goal here, is that somebody will feel motivated and somebody will know that, respective of their upbringing or respective of their upbringing, they can achieve what they want to in life.
Awesome. And I told you before how excited I am, and I'm hoping I can within a short space of time, ask you every single question I want to ask. But tell me about from Decoy, and I hope I'm pronouncing it right. Decoy?
Yes, that's correct. Decoy.
Okay, from Decoy, St. Mary, to, as you described it, the mountains of East Tennessee. But tell me first about what Decoy, St. Mary was like for you as a young man.
Decoy is it formed me and it shaped me into who I am today as a young man. I remember in my very formative years having to get up in the mornings before going to primary school to run to the river behind my house to get water so that my mother would have water to do the domestic chores for the day. And when I returned from school, I would have to do my chores, whether it was go get my goats or carry more water or go cut broom. A lot of kids nowadays don't know what that is, to sweep the yard, or go climb the breadfruit tree to pick breadfruit for dinner, or something like that. Decoy is a small rural farming community on the outskirts of Guys Hill, and it's a very tight-knit community. So growing up in Decoy, it was the tradition for you to say good morning to everyone that you pass. And so I would walk past people 3-4 times in the morning. I would be like, good morning, Mr. Artie. Good morning, Mr. Mike. And I would walk past them 5 minutes later and say good morning again, because that's the way you were taught. You were taught that if your parents and the neighbors were in an argument, it did not involve you. And so you still had to pay your respect to them. So Decoy, I love Decoy. It shaped me. I'm proud of my community. It has built me into the young man that I am today.
Oh, Andre, that's powerful, and I want you to tell me about, I like to call them the angels on earth. You described being raised in abject poverty. You obviously had the aptitude to do great things, even notwithstanding your circumstances. Do you recall who first identified that in you? When did you learn, I have the aptitude to do the work, even though I don't have the resources necessarily?
when I sit back and I look at it and think about it, it was my mother. My very first remembrance of my mother teaching me something is remembering when I was around 3 years old. I remember my mother teaching me how to spell my name. At the time, I didn't know it was my name, but now that I look back at it, because I have that memory, it's very distinctive in my mind, right? It's a very distinct memory. Um, and when I got to primary school, I did not do well in basic school, as we call it in Jamaica. I remember my father going to pay my basic school tuition once, and the principal at the time told him that he didn't need to pay any money because I wasn't doing anything. But when I got to primary school, I developed this love for reading. And so I would take home the reading books, even when they were not given to me, and my mother would teach me to read them. So by the time I was in second grade, I was reading like at the grade 4 level. Teachers from the grade 4 and grade 5 classes would come for me to come and read to their students. I developed that knack for learning very early. But it was because my mother was very deliberate, Ryan. My mother, having not gotten the opportunity to further her education, because my mother had me when she was 18, she got pregnant at 17, she decided that we, her children, we had to get that education. And so she did everything in her power to ensure that we recognize the value of having a good education. You know, the one thing my mother has always said to us, my mother's favorite saying is, I pray to God when my dead and gone, that my children would have passed the worst. And of course, you know, she said it in our Jamaican vernacular. And every day she would tell us that you must use whatever opportunities you get to make yourself better. My mother consistently told all of us what her goals for us was and what her dream for us was. But you know, the one thing that I realized today is that none of us have never asked our mother, what is your dream? And so I realized, Ryan, that I am my mother's dream because she put everything into getting me where I'm at today.
Shout out to mom and her impact, and not only her impact, but her legacy now, because as you've said, you are her dream, and that's powerful and inspiring, man. Yeah. So talk to me about how you ended up in Knoxville.
You know, God has an amazing way of working out things. I knew beforehand like that I did not want to stay in New York for various reasons. And so when I was in the final semester of law school, I got this email and the school was advertising the Gideon's Promise Fellowship. Now, Gideon's Promise Fellowship caters to public defender offices in the South, where they would take students from the top 25 law schools in America who are interested in public service to work in those offices. So I applied to Gideon's. It's a very competitive process. I was accepted. And that's pretty much how I got to Knoxville. Initially, I wanted to go to Augusta. I interviewed with Augusta, got the job there, but then found out like a day later that the application for the Georgia bar was going to be closed. And so I wouldn't have sufficient time to do the application. So then I applied to Knoxville. Knoxville liked me. I fell in love with Knoxville, loved the nature of the office. Yeah, and the rest is history, as they say.
I love that, man. I love that. I love that. So it seems to me that you knew early in the game that you wanted to be an advocate for the indigent and marginalized members and communities.
It did, because you know, of my own background, my own upbringing, I tell people all the time, I said, I describe my life as my upbringing as a dichotomy. And people ask me, you know, what do you mean by that? And I grew up in abject poverty. And my mother's side of family is dirt poor. My father's side of family, they're not filthy rich, but they did have some money, right? And my father, he was not present in the formative years of my life. He did come around when I was much older, and he did contribute to my academics, you know, paying tuition, providing me with lunch money here and there. But it was really my mother who did most of the work. And so even though I grew up poor, one of the things that I learned from my mother from very early was that whatever you had, it was never too small to share with someone. It could be the smallest thing. It was never too small to share with somebody else. And so I grew up appreciating that. And when I went to law school, I know I didn't want to be a prosecutor, but I did not know then that I wanted to go into public defense. I just thought I was going to have my own private firm, etc. But when I interned at Nassau Legal Aid and I saw the disparity that was meted out to people of color, I was like, okay, I definitely have to do public defense. And that's when, public defense became my niche. And I really enjoy doing defense work and I enjoy helping indigent people. Because here's the thing, I don't think the quality representation, legal representation that a person gets should be based on the number of zeros that they can place on a check. So I tell people all the time, I will never be a rich attorney, but I sleep very comfortable at night going to my bed because I feel like my work is the continuation of the civil rights movement.
And one has to understand it doesn't mean you condone criminal activity, but you want to ensure there are safeguards that everyone has regardless of income. And that's hard for people to understand.
It's a very hard concept because people ask me all the time, how do you represent those people? And I say to people, my job is never about going into court and saying whether or not my client is guilty or not guilty. That's not my job. My job is not proving their innocence. My job is going into court and ensuring that the constitutional safeguards that are guaranteed to my clients are upheld. Once that is done, the outcome is the outcome, whether it's guilt or not guilty. But funny enough, Ryan, a lot of persons who ask me, how can you represent those people? These are the same people who will call me at 1 a.m. in the morning or 3 a.m. in the morning, or they will send me a message like, can you get in touch with me immediately when I call? Oh, my son picked up a charge or my nephew picked up a charge. Can I get your help? So at the end of the day, if we think about it this way, most of us are Christians and nobody is the worst thing they've ever done. Because if we're the worst thing we have ever done, then salvation would mean nothing to us.
It's powerful, man. So there's a quote I took from, and I'm hoping to post it when I put the podcast out, your Knoxville Bar Association feature. And there is a quote in there that you are a living dichotomy in a sense. And the phrasing or the paraphrasing is, your family structure reflected the classist divide of wealth and power commingling at the crossroads of poverty, family, lineage, and educational status. I'm going to ask you, Andre, to walk me through what that means. I love the phrasing, and I'm going to ask you, it's a two-part question. One, in terms of your own family structure and dynamic, but also what you saw when you went on to university. Because I think that also touches on what you pointed to, that classist divide as well.
Growing up as a child in Decoy, at 7 years old, if you asked me if I was poor, I would have said to you, no. Because as a child, I didn't realize that I was poor. But when I grew up seeing that I was treated differently from my other cousins. I didn't grow up seeing my mother and father together. My mother and father separated when I was very young. I don't think they were ever in a relationship. You know how man and woman story goes in Jamaica. But there was always this tension between my paternal family and my maternal family. And I grew up feeling like I was the proverbial black sheep of the family. There's no doubt about it. I was treated differently. I was not one of the favorite grandchild. I grew up hearing that your nose big, you're ugly, you come from that side of the family. You know, when my mother got pregnant, and this is what I was told, so I can't, I don't know the truth of it, right? This is what I heard. One of the comments that was passed was, why did my father go there? As in, why did he go and have a relationship with my mother? And so when I was in primary school, Ryan, I remember the first time I got a new uniform in primary school was when I was in grade 5. And that's because my mother sacrificed and made those new uniforms. And those uniforms took me to high school. So when I got to high school in first form, and I was looking around me, everybody was standing in new uniform, right? I was wearing the same pair of uniform that I got when I was in grade 5 in primary school. There were days when the only thing that my mother could afford to provide for me and my siblings was cornmeal porridge. And I'm not talking about cornmeal porridge that was flavored with condensed milk and cow's milk. I'm talking about cornmeal porridge that the only thing that we had to put some flavor in it was sugar. We didn't even have vanilla. And I would come home from school and my mother would leave her share, her portion, so that my siblings and I could have it. And so that's what I'm talking about, you know, when I talk about the fact that I grew up in this dichotomy, because while my father's side of the family is not extremely wealthy, they do have money. They're more educated than my mother's side of the family. You know, my father is way better off than my mother. And my father was not there in my formative years. At best, his contribution could be described as piecemeal. My father really stood up to the plate when I got to high school and was in grade 9. That's when he really became a part of my life.
Andrea, and you know, I have to be honest with you, what you've described is a burden I carry as well. You know, you must wonder, I mean, you probably know better than I do, the Andres that are out there who are without resources, but have the potential or could, with help or aid, get access and do pretty well. And there are so many of those painful stories in our country, Jamaica. Wow. And what did you see now when you got to university in terms of this classist divide? Because now you're mingling with, you know, we like to call them the uptown.
But here's the thing, right? We don't even have to talk about university. When I was in primary school, I remember being in grade 6 and my mother was pregnant with maybe her 6th child at the time, because my mother has 9 of us, right? And she wasn't able to give me lunch money to go to school. And so I would go to my grade 6 teacher and I would say, sir, I don't have any money for lunch today. And he would give me lunch. And one day he said to me, you have to tell your mom to come and see me. And so, of course, you know, my mother come to school. She's heavily pregnant because she's maybe 7 or 8 months pregnant at this time. And I don't know the conversation that my teacher had with my mother. But when I went home that evening, she was furious, extremely furious. And she said to me, I've always taught you that you should satisfy with the little that you have. And apparently what happened was my teacher had called her to school to say, not in the exact term, but what he was saying was that this was becoming too much for me now. This was becoming a burden that he was coming to me every day for lunch. And so just imagine me having to face my teacher the next morning at school, knowing that he had said that to my mother, the humiliation, the embarrassment, right? When I graduated from primary school, at that time, I went to Guysville Primary. And for graduation, the guys would wear blue tuxedo and black pants and whatsoever. My mother struggled and she made me a jacket suit. So I was the only boy there, you know, well dapper out in my jacket suit and my blue tuxedo and my black shoes. But you know, Ryan, I don't have a picture of my graduation from primary school because my mother wasn't able to afford to pay for a picture. I went to graduation, and after graduating that evening, I did not have a night's dinner. I went to my bed hungry. When I went to UA, when I went to high school, when I went to Charlemont, I had a friend, he was getting $500 a day for lunch money. I got $100. I had to pay $80 for taxi fare at Charlemont. I had $20 left. Most morning, by the time I got to school, I was hungry. I spent that $20 to buy something at the gate. I remember going to the guidance counselor for lunch. And it got to the point where the guidance counselor said, no, your mother has to come to school to sign up the lunch forms. And Ryan, my mother was now pregnant with her 8th child. So she can't come to school. She don't have any money to come down to Linstead, take 3 taxis to come to Linstead. So guess what I did? I continued taking lunch, but I would write my name in the book that they have in the lunchroom to say I took lunch. But knowing that my mother didn't come to school, what I took was a small box drink and a butter kiss biscuit, like the small one. And I was in my class one day and I'm in first form. And the guidance counselor walked up to the classroom. And in a very loud, demanding voice, guidance counselor called out my name, and I went outside and he took me down to the tuck shop. And he was like, how dare you be taking lunch when your mother didn't come to school? Your mother didn't come and do what you're supposed to do. You're not supposed to do it. You're stealing, whatever. And dude, I was so embarrassed, right? And I remember the next day, one of the ladies who worked in the tuck shop, she sent and called me. And when I went to her, she said, if you ever come to school and you don't have lunch, come to me and I'll give it to you. And Ryan, I was so embarrassed that I did not go, right? I would go to school and I would do without, because, my mother told me one thing. She said, Andre, take in your education, because that is going to be your passport to a better life. And so I know I spent a long time answering this question, but it's not a question that I can answer in a minute, because there's so many layers to this question that it would take me an entire day or even an entire month to unpack this question.
Because it's against the backdrop of ridicule and embarrassment. This is you're learning in this environment.
Correct.
That couldn't have been and to your credit, man, you speak about it very matter-of-factly, but I can't imagine how difficult that was. And I told you during the pre-taping, Andre, that a lot of people will connect with your story, and many of them have not had the forum to address some of the inequities that you've identified. And no doubt some of it has propelled you to your current line of work now, where you're serving on behalf of members of communities who are disadvantaged and marginalized as well. From, as you've defined it, the rural community of Decoy now to the mountains of East Tennessee. Why public defense? Why criminal defense work? Why a public defender as the method that you are now using to advocate for people?
Everything that I do, I always attribute it to my mother. And my paternal family don't like when I say that I'm a product of a single parent. But really and truly, it was my mother who was there in my formative years. And I'm not denying the fact that my father did contribute to my education and he did contribute to my success, but it was my mother who was there with me all the way, from the beginning to where I'm at now. And growing up poor, my mother always said to us as children, no matter what you have enough to share with someone. So it was never too small to share with someone. And so I grew up, and everybody knows that once you come to that community of Decoy, if you didn't have somewhere to stay, they would say, go down to Shelly, and Shelly would put you up. Shelly is the name of my mother, right? And so it was very customary for my mother to be putting up strangers, for my mother to be taking in other people, ensuring that they have a roof over their head. And so I grew up with this idea that I should give back to society and I should give back to those around me, that kindness and love and, meekness and humility are the basic premise of life. And so that is why I do public defense. I do public defense because when I look at my clients, I see myself in them. Brian, I'm not supposed to be where I'm at today. I'm not supposed to be the only Black male practicing in an office of 28 attorneys, where I'm the only African American attorney in that office. Statistics says that I should have failed, that I should have either been a gunman, or I should have been killed by police by now, or that I should have been in jail. I do what I do because my mother sacrificed for me to be where I'm at. And so you said earlier that I talk a matter of factly about poverty, but it was never easy. And people ask me all the time, why is it you talk about being poor? Aren't you growing up poor? Aren't you embarrassed by it? And I'm like, of course, because guess what? Growing up poor, people say, what did they do? It's like somebody did something wrong, right? Your mother has 9 children. Why didn't she stop at 2? Or why didn't she stop at 3? Why didn't she go and better herself? But she had 9 children, but guess what, Brian? She worked very hard to ensure that all of us went through school, that all of us are self-sufficient and independent and can take care of ourselves. And my mother has never looked at me and said, listen, you're supposed to be my pension. You're supposed to come and take care of me. When I graduated from university with my undergraduate degree, I was working for the UN. And one day my mother called me and I didn't answer my phone. And I called her back and she said, where were you? And I was like, oh, I was outside doing my laundry. And she said, why? I said, oh, my machine stopped working. My mother told me at 23 years old that I should take my clothes from Kingston to Guysville to her, right? And when I went to Guysville, my mother gave me a receipt. The money that I was giving my mother monthly, Ryan, my mother had saved money out of that and she bought me a washing machine. I could afford one, but she bought one for me. And so my principles, my core principles were formed and developed by seeing my mother doing things for others and by listening to her and by the principles that she instilled in me.
Andre, in that article that I read, which I told you was triggering for me, the Knoxville Bar Association featured Andre in an article. And there's a part of the article where you said you were raised in a world you did not understand. Now, amplify that for me. Raised in a world I didn't understand. Are you just talking about Jamaica, or was it further compounded when you came to the US? Or a little of both?
Dude, you're touching some cards right here, man. Ryan, my story is very complex. It's a really complex story. And I tell people all the time that I'm very shy, and people are like, oh no, you're not, because I like to talk, but I talk if I'm comfortable with someone, or that's me. But if I'm in a setting where I'm uncomfortable, I won't talk. Growing up in Jamaica, I struggled with figuring out my voice and my place in that society. I grew up in a household where it was just my mother. And yes, she had her husband, but he was not my father. We didn't have a relationship. The relationship between my mother and my stepfather was tenuous. It was, it was just ongoing. And me being the only child that was not his child, he never really cared for me, and I didn't care for him, to be frank. And it was my mother, my grandaunt. I grew up around mostly women. When I started, developing a relationship with my paternal family, what came out of that was me trying to develop myself and find out myself. Because the moment that relationship started, it was, you're not good enough. You're not masculine enough. You're not manly enough, family. And so for me, at 16, I had to be trying to figure out, how do I fit in? How do I find my place in this family? And so when I started having a relationship with my father, while I was doing well in school, I would conflate things. I want this man to love me. I want to be his son. I want him to I am just proud of Andre. So if I got 90 in school, it was 95. And then that affected our relationship. right? Because after a while, he lost that trust in me because I was just working so hard to gain it. But it was also the pressure that they placed on me, right? And then also it's just the societal pressure again of being a young man in a society where I did not have a father figure in my life for the formative years of my life, and trying to figure out how to navigate that space, how to be a young man who is academically inclined and not be ostracized by those around me. Because you know the sayings, when you grow up in a society where you're academically inclined, then you know the stereotypes that come, you know, and we don't have to go down that road. And so those are some of the things I struggled with in high school. Those are some of the things that I struggled. When I bought my first car, Ryan, and I went to the gas station and I took the nozzle off and put that in my car, it was a triggering experience for me. And a lot of person might be like, what? How that triggered you? Right, but I wished it was me and my father who had gone to purchase my car. And I wish I'd had an opportunity where my father would have taught me to drive. When I bought my car, one of the things I struggled with was, what if I got a flat tire? I don't know how to change the tire on my car. I had to go and figure it out on YouTube.
That's layered, boss. You know, when I bought my first car, and I laugh about it now, but it was so similar. It was a used car, and I sat in I didn't go with a mechanic because I didn't know any better. I bought a used car and, you know, liked what the car looked like. And I sat in the car. I probably turned it on, turned the wheel a few times. But like you said, having the guidance, having the help, it helps with navigating a world that for a lot of other people, they take for granted those things. You know, when that is not only present, but that validates, it makes a world of difference, man. Yeah. That is it's sobering. It's sobering as well. Raised in a world I did not understand. That is layered. And how was it compounded now when you came to the US?
Listen, when I came to the United States to do my master's, I was 27 years old. And prior to that, the longest period of time I would have spent with my father was 2 weeks. And that would have been when I was 25. And I love my father. I love my father to death, right? When I was younger, I could tell you if my father was coming to Jamaica and I didn't, and without him telling me, because I would feel it, right? And so I moved to New York at 27. I moved into my father's house to live with him, to see, you know, we can form a relationship. And it didn't work out. And it didn't work out for various reasons. And it wasn't his fault entirely. It's some of my fault. But at 27, he was trying to grow me. And that's understandable because he's trying to make up for the years that he would have lost. But at 27, I've already formed my own thoughts. I would have developed my own philosophy. I have already decided where I want my life to go. I'm not a child anymore, you know? Unfortunately, you missed out on that part of my life. And so we had a very contentious relationship. But I also was navigating a world where I was a minority. I went to a private Jewish law school in Long Island, New York. I was a double minority. I was maybe one of 10 Black males in the school and one of probably 3 Jamaicans. When I started at that school, I was the only Jamaican, right? I remember I answered a question in my contracts class one day, and I was the only person who could answer the question. And this young lady said to me after class, "Where are you from? You have a very nice accent." So I said, "I'm Jamaican." She said, "Oh, you speak very good English for a Jamaican." So I looked at her and I laughed and I said, "Listen, man, English is my first language. We're a Commonwealth of Britain." I walked to school for the 3 years I was in law school. I walked maybe 20 blocks every day to school. Summer, winter, spring, autumn, fall, you name it. I walked to school. I walked to school in 20 inches of snow. So for the first semester in law school, my younger sister took me to school, right? She wasn't able to take me to school for the other semesters because she started going to a different school and she had work and all of those things. Everybody at my school, Ryan, when you looked in that car park, you were looking at Audis, BMW. If you were driving a Toyota at my law school, people would laugh you to scorn. I walked to school. There were days when I went to school. I'm doing a master's program. And let me tell you something, when my stepmother would buy grocery, I would take up like 3 fingers of ripe banana and I would put them in my room. And I would make banana fritters in the morning and take it to school because I did not have money to buy lunch. And that's what I would eat for the entire day at school, while my classmates were going to Dunkin' Donuts and they were running to whatever vegan restaurant. That's what I ate in school. I went to school in my master's program for the first semester without having a laptop. I lived in America for the first 6 months without having a cell phone. Yeah, so when I came here, it was a struggle. It was a struggle to acclimatize because I left a world where I was independent. I was making money. I was able to take care of myself. I lived in my own apartment. I was able to buy the things that I want. And I moved into my father's house where I became dependent on him.
How much of your dad did you see in yourself, notwithstanding the fact that you guys didn't have a great relationship? And you could go from physical description to temperament. Walk me through that.
Depending on my haircut, I look like my father sometimes. I think naturally when you look at me, I have more features of my mother. I'm short-tempered like my father. I am easily annoyed. I like things done a particular way. I'm very set on tradition. Family is very important to me, and that's something that I take from him. Hardworking, he's very hardworking. I used to say that I'm religious. I no longer am. I'm a very spiritual person. I grew up a Seventh-day Adventist. I still believe in the Adventist faith. But, again, based on everything that I've been through in life, I think I've stepped away, not from God, because I don't want to get, persecuted by the listeners and the viewers, but I've really stepped away from religion, not from God, from religion. So I'm not a religious person anymore. I'm very spiritual. I see a lot of my father in me, a lot. The good, the bad, the ugly, the indifference. And here's the thing. I'm not saying that my father is a bad person. That's not what I'm saying at all. What I'm saying is, I think because of circumstance, because of situation, because of tradition, whatever issues my paternal family had with my maternal family, that affected our relationship. And so the relationship that I have with my father is not the relationship that I would want to have with my father, if you get what I mean. And that's not entirely his fault, because I'm pretty sure it was difficult for him when I was in that space in trying to understand me, because he didn't get to grow up with me. He was abroad trying to make life. And I'm pretty sure if you ask him, he would say that he went abroad to make life better for his children. And I can't fault him for that. And I actually don't blame him for anything that has happened to me.
There are some triggering stories or illustrations in the article. And I told you offline that for me, being a proverbial man-child in the promised land and an immigrant, there were some social cues I wasn't prepared to address, or when they were presented to me, I didn't have the proper defense mechanisms. One of that, and I related to you, was being shouted at by professors, judges, individuals. I came into this country believing that racial issues had resolved themselves, and all I had to do was work hard, and I would be able to navigate by holding my head down. I wouldn't get in anyone's way, and it would be a harmless process. But I've learned, and I told you late in my 40s, that there were some things that I wish I were more prepared for. Um, and in your article, you highlighted some of them. The racial animus that meets men of color, regardless of where you're from, even when you are dressed professionally. And there were a couple that broke my heart in the article. Highlight that for our listeners and viewers.
So I'll preface this by saying that being a Black male in the criminal legal system in America is exhausting. And I deliberately call it the criminal legal system because to me, there's no justice in this system. Being a Black player, being a criminal defense attorney takes so much preparation each day. On a daily basis, before I go to court, I have to prepare myself. I have to constantly remind myself that today, Andre, you cannot afford to get angry. Today, you cannot afford to raise your voice because you will be seen as the proverbial angry Black man. Today, when you go into court, even if you're getting some pushback, maybe you want to save some of your arguments, whether it's evidentiary, whether it's procedure, whether it's substantive, for the next court appearance, because you don't want to be deemed as difficult. But also, ensure that your dressing is on point. Ensure that you're properly groomed. Ensure that your haircut is appropriate for court. My white colleagues don't have to do that, all right? And then when you enter the courtroom, you now have to ensure that before you even enter the courtroom, let's take it a step back. You have to ensure that you know your case better than the prosecutor, and you know it better than the judge, and you know it better than your white colleague, right? So you have to spend a lot of time knowing everything about your case. And then you enter the courtroom or you get your client, and you have to ensure that your clients, you get your clients to the place where they believe that you can do this work. So you're not even talking to them about the substance of their case.
That's
You're building
exhausting,
them
bro.
up. Bro, tell me about it, right? You have to be building them up to trust you. Because when they look around you, all they see is white judges, white prosecutors, white lawyers, and you're the only Black man standing there. So why should they trust you when their liberty is at stake? Why should they trust you to defend them? So, my very first experience with discrimination in the criminal legal system happened while I was in New York. I was in court and I'm sitting in the chief judge chamber, and the court officer, she walked up to me and she said, "Sir, has your case been called as yet?" And I had case files in my hand, had my briefcase, had my suit on, and there's a white kid sitting behind me and he's wearing sneakers, jeans, and t-shirt. And she walked up to me and I said to her, "I'm not a defendant." Ryan, would you believe that the next morning, so this occurred like Tuesday at 2 p.m. Wednesday morning at 9 a.m., I'm walking into the courtroom and this very same court officer came and shoved me in my chest and said to me, "Sir, defendants do not come into the well of the court. Defendants sit at the back of the courtroom," right? This occurred in New York. And a lot of persons would say, "Oh, but New York is a liberal place," right? When I moved to Knoxville, I went to the jail to visit a client, and I'd been living in Knoxville for 1 year at that time. And I went to visit a client. And one of the sheriff deputies asked me if I was there to turn myself in. Just 3 weeks ago, Ryan, I was in court and a judge yelled at me and told me that he would arrest me, all because I was advocating for my client.
Andre, didn't I tell you this was going to happen, though, that this was going to go? Because you're touching As you say, you're touching the corns, man. This is real. Let listeners and viewers know, Andre, what the criminal justice system is like for someone who is poor. And we can intersect with race if you'd like, but amplify that for listeners.
Oftentimes people tell you, and philosophers and sociologists and criminologists will say, oh, politicians, crime, poverty is not a crime. That's not true. If you're a poor person in America, poverty is indeed a crime. Because I have clients sitting in jail who cannot afford to bond out, and their bond is $50. When you think about mass incarceration in America, it's very deliberate and it's very strategic. It is geared towards keeping a certain class of people as a subset of society. And if you look at American history, you realize that at no point Black people in America were truly free. Whether it was slavery, Jim Crow era, to the era that we're now in, because the criminal legal system is designed to keep a certain class of people in place at a certain level of society at all times. And so let's look at this. You have John Brown. John Brown picks up a theft, which is a Class A misdemeanor. The longest amount of time you can spend in jail on a Class A misdemeanor is 1 year. And so that person, let's say they put him on unsupervised probation. So there's no jail time. They're on unsupervised probation. But guess what? That person has to miss work to come to court. And when they miss work, they're not getting paid. Now they have to pay court costs, and the court cost is calculated based on the number of times that you have come to court. So it's not a set court cost. So if your case was reset 4 or 5 different times, then you're going to pay court costs for those 4 or 5 different times that you reset your case. And if the 1-year anniversary of the case comes around and your court cost is not paid, then you can be held on a violation of probation. But not only that, the person now has a criminal record. Employers are now going to refuse or are not going to employ that person because they don't want any criminal working in their business or in their establishment. And so that person has to go and find something that is paying them minimum wage. And the person has to make a decision between, am I going to pay my court costs, or am I going to buy food and diaper for my children? Or am I going to keep the electricity on? Or am I going to pay my insurance? So the criminal legal system, if you're a poor person, you don't have to worry about paying your bond. If you're a rich person, you don't have to worry about a bond. So what you often see is that the person with wealth, who is oftentimes the white person, who is charged with the exact same crime as your client of color, is able to get a better resolution. Because when you're outside of jail or outside of prison, you can always help in your defense. And so, that is why it is important, Ryan, that persons like yourself and myself, we are players in the system, because it gives our clients confidence when they walk in the system and they see somebody looking like them. Not only do we have shared experiences, but we understand the language, we understand their culture, we understand their point of view, and we can then in turn interpret that, transcribe it, and put it in front of the judges and the prosecutors who are so far removed from the realities of our clients.
When you started out, I had this feeling of a burden now, because what you've amplified and articulated and given voice to is the fact that there are so many young men and women who grew up or are in the situation you were in when you were coming up. It's two things. One, what can we say to them when they look around and they don't see the prospects? What can you say to encourage them? And two, what can individuals do to reach back and pay it forward? And I know those questions are layered, man. Both of them are. But it's the burden
I
I feel when I listen to your story and all that you've accomplished. And I'm like, there's so many young men and women who need a
I
hand.
think oftentimes, like, we as a society, based on our, what we went through, slavery, colonization, being denied access to education, there's this perception that the only way to be successful is academic success. And so, especially, in the Caribbean, Jamaica, parents oftentimes only believe that success is only academic. And so they want their children to be lawyers and doctors and engineers and nurses, and nothing is wrong with that. But I think it's also time for us to broaden our scope and realize that, there are plumbers out there who make more money than I do. There are carpenters out there who are taking home way more money than I ever could dream of, right? So that's the first thing. Success is not just academic. The other thing is, it is good to transport yourself to the place where you want to be. So for me, when I was growing up, I would always read and try to appreciate what I was reading and to put myself in those places because that's where I want to be, right? And I would say to myself that one day I'm going to have my own car. One day I'll be able to travel the world. One day I'm going to buy my own house. I didn't know it was going to be in America because I wasn't thinking America at that point. But I would put those things out there in the universe. And so I started making very small steps towards achieving those things. And there were times that I failed, Ryan. One of the things that I didn't mention was that I repeated first form in high school because I failed. Because here's the thing, when I started Charlemont, I didn't go to school maybe for about 2 months because my mother couldn't afford it. I didn't get to sit one set of my exams. I think it was the end of year exams. So they could not send me on to second form because my academic performance was terrible. It was embarrassing. All the people that were my classmates, they were like laughing at me. Look, oh, he's there repeating first form. It's first form. It's supposed to be the easiest year of your academic journey. But guess what? Failure does not define your final destination. Neither does poverty. You're born poor, you don't have to die poor. Yeah? And your parents owe you nothing. They give you the greatest gift, and that is life. Just believe in yourself, and that may sound abstract. What is believing in yourself? Talk it out, put it out there in the universe. This is what I want, and I'm going to achieve it. And when you achieve it, don't forget where you're coming from. I still walk barefooted when I go to Jamaica. I still go to the river and have a shower. One of my favorite things to eat is curry chicken back. That's something that I love. And when I go to Jamaica, that's something that I'm going to ask my mother to cook for me. Be respectful, be kind, have integrity, be a person of your word. Don't be afraid to ask for help. And that's one of the things that I did not understand until I got to America, because I thought that asking for help was nepotism. So when I got to America, it's when I realized that there's a difference between networking and nepotism. Yeah. And the other thing too, Ryan, is you have to take care of yourself. There's this idea that as men, you're supposed to be tough and you're just supposed to navigate life and go through it. Go on all the meds, man. Just go and fight it out. I had to go and take care of my mental health in order to reap success. And not just reap it, to understand it and appreciate it. Because, for a very long time, I struggled with imposter syndrome. I would tell myself that I don't deserve to be here. Why am I here? I could not appreciate. I'm like, is it Like, did I just fall through the cracks? Is it an accident? Am I really in this place? You know, even though I envisioned it for so long, it was very hard to appreciate it. And so once you get to that place, you know, give back. How do you do that? Start mentoring young kids around you. If it is, assist where you can. It doesn't have to be $100,000. It can be $500. Buy a textbook. Establish a small scholarship at your school. Give back to your community. You know, those things. Take care of the people who took care of you.
Okay, so I land the plane with this. You are your mother's dream. Give us a moment when everything came together, all her struggles, all her prayers, all her sacrifice. Take us to that place when you could say, Mommy, here is the fruit of all that you did for me. Take us to that place.
Oh man, that's a question, bro. Seriously, that's a question. 2 moments. 2019, when I walked across the stage at graduation, and they called my name, and I collected the diploma, and I was like, yes, this is it. Because as you said in the intro, I have an LLB from the University of the West Indies. My intention was to finish law school in Jamaica, but I took out student loan for my undergraduate degree. And when I finished my law degree, I did not have the money to go to Norman Mandela Law School. So I worked for a year, and I worked for a year as a teacher. And working for a year as a teacher in Jamaica, the salary was nothing. So it was basically just paying my rent. So I wasn't able to save. So that is why I ended up finishing my education abroad. But while I was finishing my education abroad, Ryan, there are several things that happened. My mother had a stroke, and she went into the hospital, and she was in there for a couple months. And I wasn't able to I wasn't able to go to Jamaica and see her because I didn't have the money to buy a plane ticket. But it was about to be exam season, and I couldn't leave. So when I walked across that stage, that was the first time in several years that I cried, because I struggle with being vulnerable. Because, constantly hearing that you're not masculine enough, you're not man enough, for me, that was a way of asserting my manhood, being tough. And so I did not allow myself to break or to show emotion. And so at my graduation, I cried. I cried because it seemed like everything culminated. But the one thing that was missing was that my mother wasn't there, because I wanted my mother to walk across that stage with me so I could give her the degree, because it's really hers. So that was the first time. The second time was when I got called to the bar. And I was standing in the courtroom, and the judge who swore me in, it's a white female, and I got sworn into the bar on Juneteenth, and I was very deliberate about it. I passed the bar in February, and I waited until Juneteenth to get sworn into the bar, because I wanted to make it a celebration of where I'm coming from, even though I'm not American, but the significance that maybe somebody from my lineage worked on one of those plantations in Knoxville, or worked on a plantation in the South. And here I am standing on this significant day, being called to the bar as an officer of the court to serve people who look like myself, to serve people who come from similar positions and a similar walk of life, similar circumstances. That moment was like very pivotal in shaping who I am as a person. And for me to finally recognize that, yes, Andre, you did it. You know, your mother's prayer, your mother's hard work, her motivation, it paid off. And here you are.
Perfect, man. Andre, thank you so much. A young man from Decoy, St. Mary, now in the mountains of East Tennessee, serving the disadvantaged, the indigent, and those who are, for the most part, voiceless. Andre, thank you so much, man, for being a guest on the What a Word podcast. And I told you I would only need to take a few minutes of your time, and I kept my promise.
Well, all right, yeah. I thank you for, you know, giving me this medium to probably inspire some young people to say, or just to inspire people at large to say, hey, you know, today you may be feeling down, despondent, things falling apart. You know, you feel like your world is crumbling. But if this little black boy, and I say black boy, no derogatory term, right? You understand what I mean. If this little black boy from rural Jamaica, right? Deep rural Jamaica, Decoy, St. Mary, can now be an attorney in America, can walk into a courtroom in a county that would have experienced racism, in a county that is predominantly white, where I am one of, you know, maybe one of 3 black men practicing at the criminal bar, one of 2 black attorneys in my office. If I can do it, there's nothing preventing you from doing it. And it's not because there's anything special about me, because really and truly, there's nothing special about me, nothing at all. But you can do it because of hard work and dedication and discipline.
Powerful, bro. Appreciate it. We'll follow your journey. Oh, Andre, finally, social media links so people can follow your journey.
Yeah, on Facebook, I am Andre the Boss Johnson. I was young
I
once.
spelled the boss for them.
So that's DBOSS, D as in Dre, B as in boy, O as in orange, S as in Stacy, S as in Stacy. On Instagram, I think I'm Dre Boss. And on Twitter, I think I'm also, let me check. On Twitter, I'm at Wanted, that's WANTED _JOA.
Thank you, man. I'll put it in the links. Bro, thanks again, man, for your transparency, for inspiring and for reaching back, not only in terms of sharing your own story, but giving us ways we can make a difference in our small areas in terms of helping individuals, man. Thank you so much for being a guest again on the What a Word podcast.
Thank you, Ryan. Thank you for, featuring me. Appreciate it. All the best to you on your journey. Thank you.
Thank you, bro. I appreciate it, man. Most welcome.